It's a real pleasure to welcome you all tonight for this panel on maintaining a strong defense industrial workforce. Now, all the eyes in Washington right about now are on the Congress and what it may or may not be doing to bring the government to a standstill or not to a standstill as of tonight. And as that happens, many of the eyes will be on the hundreds of thousands of DoD workers who will be furloughed if this takes place starting tomorrow morning. But those who are looking past this episode, also ahead to the coming debate on the debt ceiling, may recall that it was these last debates over the debt ceiling that produced a sequestration, the effects of which animate the discussion that we're going to have here tonight. So sequestration, the debt ceiling debate, and the shutdown of the government are the backdrop against which some of the tough decisions need to be made about the defense industrial workforce. The truth is that as the cuts imposed by the Budget Control Act take effect, the defense industry will face its own mounting challenges in maintaining a healthy workforce. As modernization accounts get cut, the industrial base may find it more difficult to recruit and retain talented engineers and other technical experts whose skills are in demand from the commercial sector. Given the importance of a healthy defense industrial workforce to the quality of America's military, the future of that workforce looms as a national security issue. Tonight's CNAS brings together a distinguished panel to discuss the future of the defense industrial workforce. Unfortunately, Linda Hudson, the Chief Executive Officer of BAE Systems, couldn't be with us this evening as she fell ill over the weekend, but ably serving in her place is Dave Herr, Executive Vice President at BAE. And also joining the panel are Christine Fox, former Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation at DoD, and Arnold Punaro of the Punaro Group. These three individuals will speak about the state of the defense industrial workforce today, about the climate affecting recruitment for talented engineers and others with technical skills, and about the challenges facing the workforce and offer their thoughts for bolstering its health. To moderate tonight's panel, we're honored to have Michèle Flournoy. Michèle currently serves as Senior Advisor at the Boston Consulting Group and as Co-Chair of the CNAS Board of Directors. She previously served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and is currently a member of the National Defense Panel. With thanks to our panelists, now let me turn it over to Michèle Flournoy.
Great. Well, good evening, and thank you all for battling the traffic out there to get here. This is a really important topic that we're going to address tonight, but one that we're not hearing all that much public discourse about. As Richard said, you know, as we face deeper cuts in the defense budget, particularly with sequestration, there's a risk that our modernization accounts, our investment accounts, are going to take a disproportionate share of the cuts as pay and benefits for military personnel are off the table, and as we look, as folks in Congress and the department look for cuts that will yield immediate savings. And so my own view is that modernization is even more at risk than it might otherwise be. That is going to pose some real challenges for the health of the defense industrial base overall, but particularly for maintaining a healthy workforce. And yet, as we think about the future, maintaining a healthy defense industrial base, a healthy defense industrial workforce, they are absolutely critical to maintaining the U.S. defense technological edge. The fact that our military always has always had that as an advantage. So tonight we are very privileged to have three outstanding panelists, and I'm just going to add a little bit more to their introductions, starting with the Honorable Christine Fox, who is now the Principal Technical Advisor at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. But most of us know her as the Director of CAPE, the Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Office in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where she was the principal and most senior advisor to the Secretary on analyzing and evaluating plans, programs, and budgets of the U.S. military. I can say for my part, she was an invaluable partner in many, many three-lettered processes over the years. And prior to that, you may not know, she was president of the Center for Naval Analysis and scientific advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations. So Christine brings us very deep expertise on analyzing military operations, programs, and budgets. And thanks next to David Kerr, who is here on behalf of Linda Hudson. He is now Executive Vice President of the Services Sectors of BAE Systems Incorporated. The services sectors includes intelligence and security and support solutions. He oversees a workforce of over 19,000 people at BAE, and again brings invaluable industry perspective to our panel. And then last but not least, Major General Retired Arnold Punaro, who is Chief Executive of the Punaro Group, a consulting firm here in Washington. Prior to that, he served from 1997 to 2010 at SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation, where he was Executive Vice President, responsible for government affairs, worldwide communications, and support operations. But he's also served as chairman of the Reserve Forces Policy Board, appointed by the Secretary, and has been a very active and critical member of the Defense Business Board, chairing a number of task forces there. So again, and that's not even talking about his Hill experience. So very, very broad and deep panel, and I am looking forward very much to hearing them today. So I thought we would start out the conversation by really talking a little bit first about what does a healthy industrial base workforce look like? What is it that we would like to see? What are the attributes of such a force? And then based on that, some kind of assessment of how fragile is it versus how robust it is today. So Christine, if I could put you on the spot to start with that.
Sure. I am concerned about the health of our workforce. I think that on the government side, we've worked very hard lately to try to beef up the acquisition workforce. On the private side, I think all of the fits and starts and ups and downs of our procurement strategies have put them under some stress. My biggest concern, and I defer to our industry colleagues on this, but my biggest concern is what it's going to mean going forward, because the sequestration scenario, the cuts are so immediate that I fear that we will have no choice but to turn to places where you can actually get your hands on the money in the near years, and that's readiness, where we've already turned, and modernization. So the challenge I think we face is to identify, both in government and private, the critical skills that are necessary and find a way together to invest and cover those skills to not lose the grounds we've gained, but also to continue to make progress, but certainly not to let them tip over. I am concerned that there's some of our skills that are at that, to use a overused term perhaps, but at that tipping point, whereas if we don't protect them, we will lose them, and they'll be very difficult to regain.
Just to follow up on that, Christine, do you feel like government and industry have collaborated on that skills assessment? Do we have a common view, a detailed view of exactly what we need and where we're short or at risk of being short?
I think we've tried, and I see Brett Lambert is here, and he's tried very hard and developed some tools to do that. I know that there is a good partnership between ATL and even CAPE with industry, but I think understanding our critical skills throughout our industrial base, up and down, whether it's in subs or in the big guys, is a really daunting task. Mm-hmm. And I do fear that we haven't put enough effort on it. Again, this is a very sudden thing, sequestration, and so it's taken something that was a project kind of going along and put it into a critical state, and I am concerned that we're not ready for that.
If I could, how does it look from the industry perspective, from where you sit?
Well, I think the uncertainty is probably the biggest issue. If you think about from a talent standpoint, a lot of the engineers that come to our company really do it for three reasons. They like challenging, exciting work. There's a bigger purpose where you support the military versus some of the commercial products. And the third reason, a lot of them looked at it as fairly stable. And that third aspect, I think, is one that's, with sequestration, it's kind of go away. So those are really how we kept a lot of the key talent from going to the .com several years ago. And right now there's a lot of concern because of the cuts and a lot of uncertainty. And I think the other thing that it's an area that we're very concerned about is we think sometimes we talk about industrial base, we think about big tank plants or airplane factories, but reality is we have a lot of suppliers who are very small. And the fact that, you know, we have several hundred or thousand engineers, we lose some. But some of our suppliers have very critical technologies, and just losing a few key people could have a big impact. And some of them are really having a tough time with the actually borrowing money and being able to remain stable. Just in the last year, we've had to purchase 2 of our small suppliers who had very important technology. So it's a very challenging environment.
Do you see that kind of vertical integration as a trend that we may see going forward because of that vulnerability of parts?
Potentially, but a lot of that's really been transferred. A lot of that know-how has been transferred to the supply base. And in some cases, it's been done to reduce cost. So we're still faced with, with the budget crisis, we're still faced with the same cost challenges. So it's going to be very hard to pull that back into the primes.
Right. Arnold, you're also sitting as chair of NDIA, looking across industry. How do you see the fragility of the workforce, and particularly, are we seeing problems in recruitment and retention, any of those kind of indicators yet?
Well, from an industry perspective, we have our great leaders from AIA here I see today, Christian and of course Marion, the CEO, Micah, and we talk all the time, and AIA has done some tremendous analytical work, put out a number of publications. I think one of them is available for people to read today, and I think the way we look at it in industry and the various associations, we think of the civilian workforce, and in the civilian workforce, I include both government workers and industrial workers, the same way that General Barno and I look at the military. We want the very best, we want to recruit and retain the very best people we can in our United States military. The same applies to the civilian workforce, because if you look at why we have a Department of Defense, at least where the side of the military I come from, it's about warfighting readiness. It's about being able to protect the United States, and if we have to go in harm's way, go in harm's way. To do that, you have to be combat ready. To be combat ready, you measure 3 things. You measure the number of the military you have, and are they trained in their military skills? Is their unit trained in the tasks that unit has to perform, and do they have the technology that's going to give us the edge on the battlefield? And guess what? You can't do any of that without the civilians. Department of Defense civilians do a large part of the training of our military. They're essential to the training establishment. They're essential to the maintenance of our equipment. Global positioning system, do you think that was developed in government? No, that was developed in industry. So all the great technology, the survival gear that our individual soldiers and Marines wear, that all comes from industry. So I get pretty agitated when I see the C-SPAN and the people in Congress talking about, well, the non-essential people don't have to show up for work. Well, where I come from in the military, the defense civilians and the industry civilians are just as essential as the military. The military can't do their job without the civilians. So, and as Dave said, they want meaningful work, they want promising careers, they want to be treated with dignity and respect. And we don't see that right now, and I think that's why we're seeing, I know AIA's reports and our reports are very concerned about the ability, and you hear anecdotes of, Brett, we were talking to Brett earlier and talking to some folks about advising their kids into what field you want to go into. I want to be an aerospace engineer. Well, why would I want to go be an aerospace engineer? It's a very unpredictable. So it's something that ought to make us nervous. Just like if we started seeing a deterioration in the quality of the military coming in our recruits, we would get really, really nervous about what that military cohort is going to look like 10 years down the road, because it takes 18 years to train a battalion commander. You don't just go get somebody right out of MBA school and put them in a senior job in industry. So I think we need to be just as concerned and just as protective of our defense civilian workers and our industry workers as we are of our people in uniform.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So if we peel back the onion a little bit, again, I just want to get a more detailed sense of what are you actually seeing in industry. And David, maybe I can ask you, Is it that you're seeing, is it an issue of our educational programs not producing as many qualified people who are technically qualified, engineers, et cetera, and so it's a smaller pool, greater competition for them from the commercial sector going into the .com world or the other parts of IT other than the defense space? How much is it in the uncertainty creating further deterrence to come into defense and aerospace? I mean, what are you actually seeing at the ground level in terms of recruitment and in terms of retention for those folks who are nearing retirement age?
Okay, I think there's a few variables. Number one, we're not graduating enough students in science and math, so we are out there competing with commercial firms, and we support a lot of that activity, and we've started a lot of apprentice programs to do some of it, because even if you don't have an engineering degree, the type of work we do, even in our factories, they're never fail type of systems, and everybody in the company has to have some special skill. So we've created a lot of apprentice programs. But from a college graduate standpoint, it's really that, how do you recruit those individuals over a lot of the commercial opportunities, and that job market's starting to pick up. From a retention standpoint, if you look at the workforce, and I think our companies, like a lot of others in the industry, probably 50% of our leaders are going to be eligible to retire in the next 5 years. And this industry is, for lack of a better term, kind of skipped a generation in the last downturn. So what we've got is a lot of 50-plus employees, and we've kind of missed out that generation. And then we've got a lot of very key people, in their 30s, early 40s, and what we're seeing are those people now starting to look at other opportunities. And that's the key area that we're concerned about from a retention standpoint. So we're very concerned because of just the demographics of the workforce. And then the other part I think that's creating an issue for us, because of the uncertainty, it's hard for us to make investment, and our employees watch that very closely. So if you don't know what's going to happen, do you want to invest in another dry dock in our shipyard facility, look how much money we would have put into IR&D projects that are things that engineers like to work on, or do we want to buy any kind of special kind of equipment, or just invest in a program? So when they see those kind of decisions getting delayed, it kind of takes a little bit of the fun factor out.
Mm-hmm. So, Christine, when you were in the department, clearly the department is very aware of these issues and trends. What are the kinds of things being discussed in terms of how to respond, how to try to mitigate some of the risk, et cetera?
So I think that the biggest challenge that we face, and there are lots of challenges, but the really immediate challenge are the sudden cuts, as I was saying earlier, which means that we need to understand what needs to be protected. And in the department, before I left, the discussions were about the need to continuing to invest in development so that we not lose our technological edge. The challenge is that with the sequestration scenario, we might be able to protect some of our highly skilled development workforce, but our ability to actually procure some of those things is going to have to be delayed. It's going to have to be delayed for a couple of reasons. One, if we take the time to start to draw down our force structure. Suppose we decide, okay, this is here to stay, we're going to draw down the force structure, something, frankly, that while the department might be on that path, the Congress hasn't accepted that yet. So there's laws preventing us from doing too much drawdown yet. But nevertheless, if you are in this scenario forever, you would want to start drawing down the force structure. We've talked in previous settings, I'm sure you're all aware of the need to get our compensation for our force to slow the growth. All of those things, efficiencies, they all take time to build. So while that time is going on, we might be able to recognize, if we were savvy about how to do it, exactly what part of our workforce, our development we needed to protect our highly skilled people we want to protect. They would be doing things, but we wouldn't be able to then procure them until the force structure comes down, the compensation savings build up, or something changes and we get out of gridlock and have a sensible budget. How do we do that? That as far as we got as far as I just described, a knowledge that we have to continue to invest in R&D, a knowledge that we have to identify critical skills and find a way to work with industry to protect them. But then how do we live through until we can actually procure them, and how do we protect our procurement, our large building skills and capabilities, we haven't gotten that far yet. And I think that's a really big challenge.
So Arnold, you spent a lot of your life on the Hill in your former incarnation. Is there any understanding whatsoever of these dynamics on the Hill? How does this play in Congress and in the politics?
Michelle, I wish I could say something positive about Capitol Hill after spending 24 years up there. But the only thing I can think of is, you know, when you think of the clowns in the Barnum and Bailey Ringless Brothers Circus, those clowns are 1,000 times more competent than the clowns that are working on Capitol Hill right now. I say that with great sadness, but the idea that somehow we're going to be able to go to Congress and get them to deal with something as complex as how do you protect the workforce when there's very little respect for that workforce by many members of Congress, either the civilian government workforce or even the industry workforce. They take the people for granted. They just assume that, you know, whatever they do, the people are just going to be there. We know that's not going to be the case. And, you know, I thought the sequester was, as Christine and many others and CNAS has done some really landmark work outlining the potential impacts of the sequester, as has our colleagues at AIA. I thought that was about the most irresponsible piece of legislation I've seen in my 40 years in Washington. But the way they're getting ready to intentionally shut the government down and all the adverse implications. So I don't really know where you go in Congress. I guarantee you there's no appreciation for the impact of what they're doing. If there was, they wouldn't be doing it. So I think we're going to have to let them get the madness out of their system, and hopefully as we adjust, and unfortunately the government workforce, particularly in the Department of Defense and the industry workforce, is going to get smaller. I mean, we are not going to beat the sequester. We're not going to beat those levels. They're not going to come to their senses. They're not going to add money back in for the Pentagon budget. So the department is in the process of adjusting their program to the new reality of the budget. And once we know what that is, I think we're going to have to all work very hard, both in industry and in government, to protect those individuals that match up with the skills that we need, tied back to some sense of vital interest, threats, and strategy. That's the other sad thing is when you look at what the Department of Defense excels at, it's not just warfighting in the field. Of all the branches of government, they have the best planning, programming, budgeting, and analytical system at all levels, and they match vital interests to threats, to strategy, to budgets, and tied to congressional appropriations. The sequester just takes that and breaks all those links. It has no relation to anything other than just cuts. And so somehow the body politic has got to get this madness out of the system before we can actually begin to work on some of these things in a substantive way. I know that's a pretty pessimistic viewpoint, but every time you turn around, it just gets worse and worse.
There's been a lot of debate about whether it would be possible to exchange a commitment to meet sequestration levels over a certain period of time, 5 years or something, in exchange for flexibility on how to implement them both across accounts and over time. If the department had that flexibility, how much would that mitigate the kind of risk we're talking about here, and how much would it still just be sort of delaying the pain? Christine, yeah.
So, okay, so if you, going by the studies that I've been part of, what we found is that even if we were to do aggressive things that would push the department in ways that we haven't pushed it in the past on efficiencies and compensation, and aggressively started taking down force structure, you would still be, of the $50 billion a year that sequestration calls for, $20 to $30 billion a year short in the near term for the next couple of years. All the flexibility in the world of how you take that out doesn't solve that problem. That's why flexibility alone is not the solution to the sequestration impact on our industrial workforce. When you're $20 to $30 billion a year short, you end up going, again, to readiness and to modernization, the places where you can actually get the money. All the other things take time. Even force structure reductions cost money in the near term. BRAC, if we could get the permission, costs money in the near term. So it's those near years. The biggest thing that would help us is to backload the reductions. Let us do it strategically and put in place the things that would take to get the levels down so that the budget is reduced in the out years, but give us the time to get there. That would not force us to do these non-strategic things and to hurt the workforces badly.
A number of folks have talked about the growing importance of international sales to sort of try to grow the pie and counter some of the pressures of our own budget cuts here at home. That's a critical part of strategy for most defense firms. How important is that? How much of the, how much could that compensate for the pressures that the workforce is under? What would it mean in terms of export control reform and so forth? Again, AIA has done some great work on this, as have others. But do you have a thought of that, Dave? And
yeah,
then I'll
it's extremely important. If you look, we're in our strategic planning cycle, and over the next 5 years, exports become a much larger share of what we see of the revenues for the next 5 years. When we talk about export reform, it's not just what we can export, but it's also the process and the timing, to make those transactions happen quicker. Mm-hmm. No, but they're extremely important. That's it's grown in some of our business to a pretty substantial amount. And in some areas, we've been able to also look at some commercial opportunities, but that's very hard. So I think one of the big ways we mitigated really some of those international sales.
Okay. Arnold?
I think it's critically important. All our industrial leaders have talked about it. Our associations work it hard every day. This administration, I know starting Michelle, when y'all first came in, when they first came into office, because I know we worked very closely with our good colleague, General Jim Jones, when he was National Security Advisor, and Secretary Gates. Christian worked and Shelley worked directly for him at State, put in place these fairly significant changes in export reform. And here's where they actually did get the Congress to help, because the Congress had been one of the big roadblocks. They got the committees on board, and we got some pretty substantial changes in the law, and now we need to get the regulations and the internal government processes to catch up with the vision that the administration has to do more streamlining there, because our companies are at a real disadvantage competitively, because the companies we compete against overseas don't have their hands tied behind their backs like ours do, particularly in the technology transfer, because you've all heard this, you all know this. We try to protect everything, so when you protect everything, you protect nothing. So we need to basically continue to work to streamline that. I think, though, Christine is right. When you look at the bathtub that we're getting ready to get into, at least in 14 and 15, and hopefully, she's right, if we could kind of backload it, it would be great. I don't know if that's possible, but for what a lot of people have said, well, we haven't seen any adverse impact from the sequester, so it doesn't hurt that much. That's because the things that are really adverse, a lot of people don't pay attention to, like military readiness. The other thing is, you cut budget authority, not outlays. Only about $10 billion of the $37 billion in budget authority that was cut in 13 is actually impacted. Another $20 billion will come in 14, and $20 billion of the $52 billion. So 14 will be 4 times worse than 13. And then if the department is given permission to rationalize the 15 budget and not have to have that be automatic and just salami slice, they can submit a more rational program. But we're going to be in a bathtub trying to sort out the mess that's been created for a couple of years, and I don't think we'll be able in foreign sales to take up that slack that quickly. But down the road, if we start doing the right things, the other thing is, this is the other adverse thing of unfortunately maybe going more in the near term to the modernization accounts. That's the equipment we sell overseas. So you look at a lot of countries, when they look at what they're going to buy, they look and see, is the U.S. military using it? Because they know if our military is using it, first of all, you've got compatibility. They know it's been time tested. They know it's going to get supported. So that gives us a real edge. But if we start sliding all these new technology programs to the right, that will hurt us as well. But I do think that that's an area that our companies are all looking at in a very, very aggressive way and working closely with the Department of Defense and with the administration on it.
Yep. So it sounds like the number one recommendation of this panel would be to try to get relief from sequestration. I think that is clear. But even if that were to happen, I think everybody believes that the overall defense budget is coming down somewhat and that our spending on procurement will still be coming down somewhat. So the question I have is, are there things what should industry be doing to cope with that? Are there further internal cost reduction steps that should be taken? Or is there further consolidation that should be considered? What are the types of things that industry can do to better position itself for, even if you had some relief from sequestration? David?
Yeah, there's a variety of things. We are cutting cost significantly in a lot of areas. Some have been benefits, but just in people. We've cut back on a lot of facilities where we've rationalized into maybe one facility instead of having 3, so we're cutting back our footprint. The other areas are, you talked about international sales, which we're expanding that. We're looking at some commercial markets. And then some of it is really around, I'm sure we all have a strategy to take market share away from our competitors. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be an interesting world. So those are some of the things we're doing in industry.
Mm-hmm. And Christine, from the perspective of what you saw in government, you talked about government assessing, the skill sets we want to protect, factoring industrial-based concerns into some of our decision-making on investments. Are there other steps that you think DoD should be taking either on its own or in partnership with industry, given the inevitable, some decline in spending on modernization?
So sort of two branch answers to that. One is, if we could deal with sequestration, and so your point that, we just need to get a better handle on procurement and modernization costs. I do think that continuing partnership between government and industry to find ways to gain stability. Multi-year procurements, for example, I think have shown to save the government quite a lot of money. At the same time, it gives industry more stability. And that gives the workforce more stability. And so all along, I think that we've been trying to find things like that as a partnership where we achieve sort of the good for both. The government gets the equipment that it needs, it gets it at a good price, and industry gets stability and the ability to order ahead and get stability for their workforce. I think in this near-term crisis, though, that is what keeps me up at night when I think about the industrial base and our ability to get through it. We really do need to do a very focused job on these skills. And I worry sometimes the dialogue goes to jobs, and believe me, I get it. Jobs are important. I have a job. I need a job. But when we think about how we're going to live through these years, as Arnold was just discussing, I think it really does need a very cold and clear view of exactly what we must protect in this country if we're going to maintain a strong technological edge in the future, post-sequestration craziness downstream.
Okay, Arnold, thoughts on that?
I would say, and I know this is going to sound like a broken record soapbox from industry, but we would like an industry, because companies, BAE, all the great, we've been cutting our indirects, meaning we've been cutting our overhead, we've been consolidating, we've been doing the things that we knew we needed to do to get ready for lean times. And the industry's been through this before. Not in the irrational way we're dealing with it now, because before you had a fairly logical, although it was a deep drawdown, following the diminishment and the elimination of the threat in the Cold War. Actually, the world's a more dangerous place today, so the threat, and it's more unpredictable, hadn't gone away. But so much of what and we'd like to focus on those skills where we're producing that cutting edge technology that's going to make the difference on the battlefield for that young soldier, sailor, airman, Marine down the road, and not have 10 people that we're paying to deal with the 25 auditors from the Department of Defense that are in our compound every day even on a small, insignificant program. And I know people talk about that, but when you add in the regulatory burden that the department puts on industry, a substantial amount of our costs are directed to busy work. Because we actually, for profit industry, we have to comply and meet audits with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The government does not. And, you know, I don't know if they ever will be in a position to do that. So, and the great thing is, I mean, Marion has led the charge with Gates and with Hagel and with Ash and with Frank. When we meet with the top leaders in the department, they are with us on that. And they say, you're absolutely right. We want to streamline that because we want the money that you're spending, and we want you to maybe spend a little more on independent research and development of your own money. If we had that money, we'd do it. But the problem is it doesn't get translated into the bureaucracy. Because when you have 154,000 people working in the acquisition workforce, they all, you know, have little things they need to get done, I guess. So I would say that's an area where we really could try to work more closely with the department and see if we couldn't get the department to reduce some of their indirects so we wouldn't have to have so many indirects, and then we could basically make more investments in the down the road technology. And by the way, those are the kind of people we want to recruit and retain. And those are the kind of people we want to tell industry, you come to work in our industry, you're going to be working on, you know, think about what people were working on back when Bill Perry was the Director of Research and Engineering. They were working on a technology called stealth, unheard of, just a revolutionary technology that our Department of Defense, partnering with industry, brought to the table. You know, we need to make sure we have that capability in the future, and we need to try to figure out a way to get rid of some of the regulatory and compliance burden that's been heaped on us.
Great. Well, I think this is a good time to open it up to the audience. So if you have a question, now's your moment. Please raise your hand, and when I call on you, let us know what your name is and where you're from, and then please ask a question as opposed to making a speech. Yes, sir. Right here. Waitress. Yep.
One other question for the panel, if I may. My name is Dale Brown. I'm glad to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. I'm from DOD, work for the Navy. I do cyber and electronic warfare. So my question for you, gentlemen, is what type of social contract could industry make in partnership with DOD to improve the process in a meaningful way that we could implement within 3 to 6 months?
Okay. Do you want to start with that, David?
What kind of contract would we make, social contract, in the next 3 to 6 months? I don't know if anything happens in 3 to 6 months, but I think it gets back to a lot of what Christine was talking about. If we could do this in a somewhat of a fashion where there's a lot of planning put to it, it just wasn't so quick and it wasn't happening with the salami slicing that's going on. If we could actually put a strategy around it and a plan, and we could work some of the issues that, for example, we talked about exports, we talked about some of the processes and audits. If we could get together on some of those things, I think we could take a lot of what I'll call non-value added costs out of the system and also increase some of the revenue opportunities. I think that. So I think it's around the stability, you know, some kind of planning, long-term planning, increase the revenue on the international side and take out some of the what I'll call waste or non-value added out of the system.
Arnold, do you have more to add on that? And do you think today the dialogue between the Pentagon and industry is what it needs to be in this period of stress?
Not, at the working levels, it is not. At the higher levels, it's pretty good, but we need it at all levels. And we need to go back to the two-way street and partnership that existed when I first went to work on the Hill in the 70s and through the 80s and even into the early 90s. In all administrations, in all Congresses, it didn't matter. Industry was a partner, and there was a two-way street, and there was a dialogue, and industry was viewed as a contributor and a valued partner. And then somehow we got away from that, and it became a little bit more of an us versus them environment. And we need to kind of break those barriers down and get that dialogue going again. I know Brett worked extremely hard in his years as industrial base. I know Sean Stackley, the head of acquisition in the Navy, is working really, really hard to do that because we understand the government's the customer. We want to support that customer. We want to deliver what you want us to deliver. On the other hand, though, you know, we in a for-profit company, you have board of directors and fiduciary responsibilities. We have to deliver for our shareholders as well. And that's, I think, Dave, Christine, I think you need to have a long-term working relationship. And I think we've got to figure out a way to get the lawyers out of the pattern. You know, there are 12,000 lawyers in the Department of Defense. That's a lot of lawyers, even for a, you know, Department of Defense. We got to get the lawyers out of the mix and put the technical people and the engineers and the program managers and industry back together, and then maybe once every 5 years invite the lawyers to come to a meeting.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Tom Oakley with the National Economics Club. I have a question, and I know you've spoken to this before in terms of the growth of just specialization organizations, organizations to cut IEDs, the growth of the OSDP staff and things like this. Are there substantial savings to be had to sort of go back to mainstream the defense organization and deal with all sorts of threats, the full spectrum threats within the sort of traditional organization?
I do think it's time for, I think that was directed to me, I do think it's time for a sort of fresh analysis of DoD organization, starting with headquarters, but you know, if you're really looking for the large pots of money, as Christine will tell you, it's not there. It's primarily in the services. But I think it, there were things we could afford to layer on and sort of grow in a period of budget growth. And you know, I'm a bit of a gardener. I wish I had more time to garden, but you know, you do have to do a certain weeding and pruning to grow a healthy garden. And I do think we are definitely in a weeding and pruning period. And I think beyond just cutting back what we have, there are some fundamental questions about where does it make sense to consolidate. My favorite example, and this will get me hate mail, but I'll say it anyway, is, you know, do we need 3 separate medical infrastructures from each of the 3 services? For example, there are lots of other candidates. In fact, maybe I'll ask the panel to contribute their favorite candidates. But Christine, I know you spent a lot of the last many months of the skimmer looking at options for cutting excess overhead. Can you elaborate a little bit on where the money really is?
Sure, I'd be happy to try anyway. Actually, we started this back with Secretary Gates and his initial efficiencies initiative. And it is a lot more challenging to actually get the efficiencies and realize them and get that out of the government than it sounds to people. Some of it is what Arnold already alluded to. You get processes going and they get a life of their own, and somebody's got to have the management courage to come along and say no more and stop that. I do think that the senior leaders in the department right now are doing that. I think they're working on it. I think the review we just came up with has proposed it. I think Secretary Kendall's work on better buying power and acquisition reform is all identifying ways to streamline it, but the proof is in the pudding, right? It's how will we be able to realize the promise of those initiatives? I think the same is true with strategic choices in management review. I think that we identified about 20% of the headquarters staff services all the way up to OSD that could come down, should come down at a time of these budget reductions. It's going to require consolidation. It's going to require reform, but it needs to happen. But I think a much greater challenge, frankly, is identifying work that we do that we don't need to do and be willing to look ourselves in the mirror and say, I don't need to be doing this in this environment. And whether we can nominate it, whether we're wise enough to see it, or whether or not we need just very courageous managers to say, sorry, that's got to go. That's what it's going to take. I do believe a 20% reduction in all headquarters across the board, as Secretary Hagel announced back in July, is going to force some of that, and then we'll see, is there more? That's on top of what Secretary Gates already did. And so there have been efficiency pairings. I think the question on the specialized organizations, I think they are also under review, and I think at time of war, might require some of those things. I think as we go back to a normal, a new normal, we need to ask those questions.
Yes. Right here on the aisle. Yes. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Brian McGrath. I'm from the Ferrybridge Group. My question is for General Punaro. Sir, I don't wish to take issue with your criticism of the wisdom of sequester. I do wish to take issue, though, with the way you lauded the wisdom of the strategy to resource allocation at the Pentagon. My research leads me to believe that through at least a half a dozen major strategic reviews since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the proportions of the money spent by the services and the Department of Defense have remained relatively stable. They're not equal, but they haven't changed much, irrespective of the strategy. So has the department created part of this problem for itself by being unable to make tough choices?
Well, I would say you make a great observation. The relative shares don't seem to change very much, whether you were in the draft era force in the 70s or as we got into the volunteer force, as you went through the peak of the Reagan buildup, as you came doing the drawdown after the Berlin Wall fell. But if you look at the content of that program, it changed markedly. So, and I mean, it's never perfect. You're exactly correct. For example, in the peak of the Reagan buildup, our great colleague, Fred Clay, who was one of Michèle's predecessors 3 or 4 times removed, said we had a requirement for the Reagan strategy of 27 carrier battle groups. Well, we even know, even with the Reagan budgets, you aren't going to afford 27 carrier battle groups. So there's always been what we call the strategy force mismatch to a certain extent. But if you look at it historically over time through all administrations, the Pentagon is the only place that has a 5-year budget. Granted, the last 2 years of the budget can be somewhat ethereal, but yeah, well, you could argue that. But as PA&E and now CAPE has gotten more sophisticated and provided the independent objective analysis a senior decision maker has to have, it's gotten better. It's never going to be perfect, and yes, there are, the services tend to basically look at it and make sure, okay, that proportion hadn't changed, but the content changes dramatically. So I do believe there's a nexus between, look, Dick Cheney and Colin Powell at the peak of their power wiped out almost every conventional weapon system we had. Why? Because the Soviet and Warsaw Pact threat went away. We didn't need them anymore. So it made sense to do that. What's irrational about the sequester, it's not linked to anything other than just blindfolded cuts. And so it breaks that, let's say it's certainly not a perfect system, but it's a much better system than anybody else in government has. It's finely tuned. Congress pays a lot of attention to it. They have detailed hearings, and Congress, obviously, you know, I've said they're not perfect, but they try to make, over the years, they look at it, they make decisions, they approve some, they don't approve others. It's a fairly thoughtful process. Sequester just totally wipes all that out. So I'd like to get back to the somewhat imperfect system we had before.
If I could just add a footnote, since I have many QDR scars all over my body, I have frequently been frustrated by the fact that strategy has not driven as much of the budget as I would have liked. What was interesting to me is once we had the BCA and we went from growth to decline, I saw strategy get a lot more traction. It got a lot of traction after the Strategic Guidance Review in 12. I think it got traction, you know, in terms of framing a lot of the skimmer choices. So even though the skimmer wasn't a strategy, you know, review of alternatives, but it was very much using strategy as the touchstone to evaluate alternatives. So in periods of when the budget is shrinking, there's an opportunity to actually connect the dots a little more tightly if there's that leadership vigilance to ensure that happens. So I neglected this side of the audience. So any questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Sean Barnett from the Institute for Defense Analyses, and I had a question about whether the panel was concerned about the defense industrial base shifting overseas, and if so, what you'd recommend doing about it.
Do you want to speak to that, David?
Yes. Not really. There's a lot of the, if you think about some of the critical skills that we need, some of the critical technologies, those are fairly restrictive of what can get done in certain parts of the world. So I think that's, that's probably not the major concern. We could potentially lose some of our, but I think at that point it's not going to be the key people that we need. If you think about at the end of this, what we want, we don't want a lot of auditors and oversight, but we need the engineers that design the product, we need the people in our factories that touch the product, and some of the key people. And I don't really see a major issue with that really going international.
Okay. Any other questions over here? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. Colonel Stephen Mariano. I work in the Secretary of the Army's office. Question is back to the workforce. There was some talk about specialization of organizations, but not about the workforce. So maybe the question, turn it around, is have you looked at generalization of the workforce in times of uncertainty? Are there things you can do to a technical workforce to make it more adaptable to the uncertainty? Thank you.
Well, we've done a lot of that, where we've had programs that have been delayed. Some that have been canceled because of budget cuts. So we've done a lot of shifting of key talent across programs, and we'll continue to do that. And we have but the issue I think now is we don't, from an employee standpoint and retention, they're not sure what to go to. They're not sure what's safe and what's not safe. So we constantly are retraining the people, moving them to different programs, getting them the new skills. And I think people look at that as somewhat of a challenge. In some cases, it's kind of a new lease on life, where they've been working on a program for so long. But the issue now, I think, is if you're working on something, we reshift. They don't know if they're just going to something that's only going to last for another short period of time, and you're going to move me again. Mm-hmm. So, and it also creates some level of inefficiency while we're going through that training process. But yeah, we're doing a lot of that.
This goes back, I mean, Christine, if maybe you want to jump in here to this, can we be clearer with ourselves and between DoD and industry on those areas that we know we will try to protect, right, because they are driven by the future threat assessment and the strategy and so forth. I mean, can we clarify some of that to reduce some of the uncertainty, at least in terms of what's safe for people?
I do think that is the really critical thing we need to do right now, and I do think it would help with the uncertainty. So I think it's a great point, Michèle. I think if I could, on the government side, the sort of the flip side, I would argue we overgeneralized. We lost some of our special skills in the acquisition workforce, which is why there's been such a push to try to rebuild it. I mean, let's face it, in the government and in the military, anybody can do any job, right? You just rotate people in and out, and that's overstated, of course, but there is something to that in the way that we manage within the department, and that has its own sets of downsides, where you do need to recognize what skills need specialization and focus protection so that you make sure we have the best that we can.
The other problem is on the government side, and we'd like to be able to be more flexible, but if you look at a basic statement of work on a contract, the government is very, very detailed and specific about not just what they want done, but the qualifications and skills of the people that you put on that task. And it's in the contract and it's in the statement of work. And you go into and say, look, you said you needed somebody with a advanced degree in electrical engineering with 8 years worth of experience working on some esoteric waveform. We've got one with 7.5 years, and a lot of times the government says, nope, that's the statement of work. So go look at any of them. I mean, we've heard all the horror stories. The recipe for chocolate chip cookies is not as bad as it was when Dave Packard had his commission. It was like 55 pages long, so it's improved. But when people started complaining about it, it was 23 pages. They weren't tasting that good, so they increased it to 31 pages to make sure so I mean, the government creates a lot of the inflexibility, and it's absolutely in the contract. And I mean, you cannot get around it. And so if when you're talking to the Secretary of the Army, tell him to see what he could do to reduce some of the 25,000 pages of laws, rules, and regulations that govern procurements with industry.
Yes, in the back.
Good evening. Thank you for letting me speak here, and I beg your pardon if my question is it sounds a bit unintelligent. I've been here in DC for a long time, and there's a lot of construction going on, and I get scared because in DC it was very nice before, and that's how I like it. But to put it shortly, would any one of you be able to enlighten us here? And I think it'll be recorded, so I hope it'll be of use to people in America and elsewhere in the world, especially from China, in China, and I'm from India. I'm not Indian, but I'm Tibetan. Any thoughts about using drugs to make people work harder, and also, some people like sponging on jobs that they just watch the employees or the construction workers by just tapping on the keyboards and manipulating the motor movements, I should say. I'm sorry, I would like to tell more, but I make people uncomfortable, so I'm sorry, and I would like to take the punch. I know nobody likes to hear the truth, also by using guys like you, and hopefully it'll be for the better good. Thank you.
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but does anybody want to take a stab at that?
If your question was, should we start using drugs to get a better worker? Was that your question?
Output. Yes.
I would say I come from the military background. We have a zero tolerance for drugs, and we have a zero tolerance in industry. If we found anybody using those drugs, we'd fire them and get rid of them. So I would say the answer to your question is, I certainly would not be in favor of it.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. I think, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Other questions? So, yeah, yes, sir, right here.
Matt Moffat, retired Navy in the Boeing Company. A question about the balance between R&D and then program acquisition. It seems over the last 5 or 10 years, we've had this great disparity between what we say we can do and what we say we want, and then what we can actually do. And I'm wondering, as we progress here in the future with items, capabilities ever increasing in cost, are we going to take a look in the department a little harder at what we can actually do versus what we want and what we can afford?
Christine, you want to start with that?
Well, I think it's a great point, and I do believe that the department is focusing a lot more on that. There's been some changes, and in fact, the Defense Business Board did a review of the acquisition process, and that was one of the points. I think that Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, in his running of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, has brought a lot more realism, or tried to, into that body. Cost is now considered in the JROC, and it never used to be, right? It was strictly the pure requirements view, and then that went over to the rest of the process to figure out, can we afford it? Weren't the best at that, as you point out. I think that we're trying, and he's trying to bring that into the discussion early on. I think the relationship between the Joint Staff, AT&L, and CAPE to do that has gotten much, much tighter in the last just couple years. Now, it takes forever to see the effects of that, right? That's one of the challenges, is I hope that that relationship, that tightness, that sort of shared view of the challenges continues long enough so that we can see some output from that and some goodness from it. So follow-on JROCs will continue to have those approaches. But this notion that we want it, too bad we want it, I think is definitely not there anymore. I think that there's a real reasonable view and a concern about appetite and telling ourselves stories. I think we've gotten past that. said, we do need to keep our technological edge, so we do need to keep striving for the future, and that's that balance that you talked about between R&D and what we actually build. Yes.
Tom Davis, former strategic planner, corporate vice president, General Dynamics, and before that U.S. Army, and I've been planted here by Dave Barno. Two questions, one for David, and I'm not trying to get into your safe under your desk, and one for Christine and Arnold, if he can overcome his native shyness and say something about it. David, on the international side of things, I mean, there is, I think, a great expectation people have out there that a lot of the reductions that Christine has described will be taken care of or offset in some degree by international sales. I think that's rather optimistic. There's very limited markets out there. People generally don't want, because they can't afford the products we have. So do you really think that there's an international market that in any significant way is going to supplement for these losses that we're going to have as we begin to try to wrestle with implementing sequestration? And for Christine and Arnold, I've conducted 2 major studies of the defense PBBS system, and I'd have to say you'd have to agree with Arnold's assessment. I have looked at the state of Virginia, the state of Maryland, Schlumberger, Montgomery County Public Schools, the CIA, the State Department. Any way you look at it, the planning process in the Defense Department is enormously superior to any of those. However, Ash Carter's made the comment 2 or 3 times that we have to recognize and we have to treat the defense industrial base as a part of the force structure. It sounds very good when you say it, and I'd have to join other people that Brett Lambert gets enormous credit for having magnificently and monumentally increased the dialogue between the department and the industry. But when you go through the things that Christine was just talking about, you know, JROCs and whatever names they're used these days, DRBs, PRGs, small groups, big groups, dogs, they masquerade in different ways. The Navy's at that, our Air Force is at that, all the units at that. Defense industry is not at any of those forums. So as opposed to participating in the process, we participate in the decision when we're told what it is. Is it time to change that diagram a little bit and bring in industry up front as opposed to only inform them at the end?
Let's start with David on the international markets.
On the international markets, if you look at it purely from a scale, you know, is there enough business to replace what we're going to lose from sequestration? Absolutely not. But there is some significant opportunities, and I think from our standpoint, you got to look at what those opportunities are. So we've got some key facilities, some key skills we want, and we think that, you know, if we can land those opportunities, it will keep those key skills employed. It will keep them around until, you know, we get to the back end of this at some point. So I think it's not just the pure scale, but it's about the specific opportunities and the skills we need to keep. And you know, we're finding some fairly, you know, they're nowhere near what was going to happen with sequestration. But it's really around those specific skills and those specific programs.
On the question of bringing industry into the process, so there's the theoretical answer, which is yes, absolutely. We need to bring industry more into the process. Practically, are you going to have a seat at the JROC? No way. So that's just the way, I mean, it's unreasonable, I think, for us to look at those internal processes where there's 10 people in the room, all the service leadership, CAPE, ATL, whatever, and expect that to be the source. So our challenge together, I would say, is to find better ways, other ways, practical ways to bring industry into the debate. And I think, though, that we need to find them. I'll brag on CAPE, my former organization. I was very impressed by how our cost analysts would embed with industry for 2-3 weeks, looking at programs, looking at processes, learning, sharing. I think we need to do more of that so that understanding of those critical skills, those tipping points, those vulnerabilities that are out there are brought into the dialogue. I know that AT&L does and tries to do that. I believe the services do, but I can't speak from experience there. But that's not really enough, and so I don't know what is. I think trying to get a seat at a DMAG, again, it's impractical. So what can we do? I don't have an answer, but I liked your question.
Yeah, so it would be, the DMAG would be too late.
Yeah, it would
in any event. 2, you're not going to bring industry in functions that are inherently governmental. We shouldn't do that. But three, the key starting point, Tom, is right now you have three stovepipe decision-making process. You have the requirements process, which Christine said Sandy Winterfield is really trying to improve, but it's not connected to the acquisition process. The acquisition process is run by a totally separate set of individuals and a totally separate set of processes. And then you have the budget process where the resources are allocated against those acquisition and the requirements. So you break these stovepipes down early on, you would think that the acquisition people would want to, the requirements people would want to know, okay, if we put in this requirement, is it technically feasible? What's it really going to cost? Well, the only place you're going to get that is from industry. You're not going to get that from the government. And when the acquisition people get that requirement, you would think they would want to be informed by the same thing. I've said facetiously, and don't put me on report to the Secretary of the Army, if the Army could get away with it, they'd want to have a nuclear tank. Why wouldn't you? Because it costs, the amount of logistics you have to refuel the M1A1 is quite substantial. If you had a nuclear tank, you'd never need to refuel it. But we couldn't afford that requirement. So, you know, thank God we don't have one. But the point is, and then the budget people, the people that make the decisions on the budget, aren't tied to acquisition, they're not tied to requirements. And so how do you know what the requirement's going to cost or whether it's technically feasible, how long it's going to take? Then how are you going to buy that system? And then you need to know from Christine and the Secretary and the civilian leaders of our government in the military departments and OSD, how much money you're going to give the services to actually implement that. So that, to me, Tom, and then that industry could be involved there. It wouldn't be inherently governmental. You could think of ways to basically do that. Industry's headache would be, we don't want to give up proprietary data and get it shared with competitors. But I believe that you could get it started there. And then, and by the way, I want to compliment Christine and Kate. Looking at the PA&E, and I heard a fellow from IDA. IDA's another crackerjack analytical outfit out there, as is CNAS. In times when budgets are tight, you need objective analysis more than ever before. When they were doing analysis of alternatives on programs, they would reach out to industry and say, okay, come in and visit with us and tell us how you can make this helicopter work better. And then a competitor would come in and say, here's how we can do it. And I think you factored that into some of your AOAs and some of your cost analysis where you're directed by law to provide to Frank Kendall. And I know, because I watch them in the hallway from time to time, the acquisition crowd wasn't always happy with some of Christine's cost estimates. Always. They always were not unhappy. But so there are ways to basically start, and again, it starts with this two-way dialogue and maybe an industry council that works with all these various activities.
Yep. Yep. Yes, sir. In the gray shirt, in the back.
My name is Samar Chatterjee from SAFE Foundation. Let me play a little devil's advocate. We were reminded by President Eisenhower, who was a military man, probably the only president from the military, against the military-industrial complex. Now, with the sequestration, obviously, now the focus, you said, is going to be strong military-industrial workforce. Is there a plan B with the potential possible weakening of the military-industrial complexes hold on our politics? Because our politics, our foreign policy is often run by a militaristic way. And given that, do you think there is going to be any change? Because our civilian presidents are so enamored with war, and obviously having a strong military helps that. So given that, do you think this change is beneficial for the country?
I can just say, having sat in multiple, countless hours of decision-making meetings in the White House Situation Room, we do not have a president who's enamored with war at the moment. But Arnold, do you want to speak to this issue?
I guess where I come from, I have 2 young grandchildren and 1 on the way. I want my grandchildren to be able to grow up in a free and independent country, have whatever potential they can achieve, and live in a secure, as secure as we can be in the dangerous world that we live in. To be able to do that, you've got to be able to protect your people and property at home and abroad. And unfortunately, you know, there's a story about the Civil War, and there was one of the generals on the southern side. His name was General Toombs. And they asked him before the war, General Toombs, how do you think you'll do? He says, well, we'll whip them Yankees with cornstalks. After the war, the right outcome was achieved. The Union was preserved. General Toombs ran for governor of Georgia, got elected. The same reporter came and asked him, well, General Toombs, you said you'd whip them Yankees with cornstalks. What happened? He said, them Yankees didn't fight with cornstalks. So the problem is, we live in a world where the people that would like to do this nation in, if the terrorists could get their hands on a crude nuclear weapon, they would blow up Chicago if they could get away with it. So we live in a real world with real threats that we have to deal with, and the only way you're going to deal with those threats is to have all the diplomatic tools, sanctions, all the great policy things that Michèle and her cohorts work on with the State Department and the NSC. But in the final analysis, just like we would never do away with our fire departments and police departments, because we're always going to have fires and we're always going to have things, we need a strong military. That strong military relies on three things. It relies on the support of the American people. It relies on the American people to send their finest sons and daughters to our military. But it relies on industry to provide the technology for us to be able to use drones to go take out these terrorists that would do our country in. So I don't believe that's being militaristic. I don't believe that's what President Eisenhower was concerned about in the military-industrial complex. Our industry is much, much smaller today than it was during the Eisenhower administration. We're totally focused on the requirements that our government gives to us to basically develop. We don't go out there and just do busy work for the sake of busy work. So I'd say we've got a pretty good system, and as Brett Lambert would tell you, we need that industrial base to be strong in the future, because hopefully our grandchildren will be able to live in as safe and secure a world as we were able in the U.S., even with the wars that we've had to fight, not of our choosing. We need that strong industrial base, and so I don't think we in industry apologize 1 second for our contribution. We're thrilled to be able to support our partners in the Department of Defense, and as a Marine, all I've asked industry to ever do is make sure they produce a tungsten tip bayonet so it would never need sharpening.
So I'm going to use the prerogative of the chair to ask a question. You know, I don't think anybody has ever accused the Pentagon of having a very cost-conscious culture. And when you look, and the question really is about the incentive structure that we've put in place in the department. And some of it is externally imposed and some of it is internally driven. When you think about the way Congress appropriates defense dollars for modernization, if I'm a program manager and I'm coming to the end of my fiscal year and I have the opportunity to save $50 million, I have to pause and say, if I save that $50 million and I don't actually spend it, because I don't need to meet my performance milestones, next year, Congress will probably reduce the size of my program by $50 million. If I'm a program manager and I'm worried about my promotion, I want to preside over larger and larger programs in terms of both the number of people I'm managing and the dollars that I'm managing. And if I'm a military program manager, I'm probably only in the job maybe 2 years before I'm on to my next thing, and I'm just trying not to have anything blow up on my watch. So when you look at this incentive structure, it breeds risk aversion. It breeds the desire to grow your programs in terms of people and dollars. It does not incentivize the core goal, which is meeting performance milestones at or below cost. So my question is, are there fundamental changes to the incentives that we could make in terms of how we reward and promote people, in terms of how we align authorities and accountabilities in the system that would produce a greater cost consciousness to be paired with the emphasis on performance and delivering value? So let me start with maybe Christine and then Arnold, and David, you're welcome to jump in too.
So, Michelle, I think what you're referring to is something that we coined the culture of savings, starting with the Secretary Gates Efficiencies Initiative that he put in place. And the observation there was the one that you're making, especially when we had a lot of money flowing into the department during the last decade and we were at war, that culture of savings, he called it the culture of spending money. And we needed to reverse that, but I think you're absolutely right. The incentives don't reverse easily. Ever since that idea came up and we talked to him about the culture of savings, some of us tried to figure out, okay, what are the incentives? What do we do to change them? How do we cook cost-conscious behavior into our promotion and reward system? Not much luck. I don't want to say we shouldn't keep trying. I think we should. I think it's essential. But it is very difficult because you have a very large, it's the GDP of a country, right? I think it's number 6 or something. It's huge. And so it has to be decentralized. So somebody has to make decisions at the beginning of how much money people get when you decentralize the budget for execution. Incentivizing those people to put the money back in the pot, there's a couple things that have to happen. They can't be penalized next year, as you point out. And the money has to be able to be used and used for good purpose. It turns out that people don't just hoard the money to buy flat screen TVs, as a lot of people think. Typically managers have a list of priorities. They work down those priorities. They definitely want to get things on contract before the end of the year. The ability to get things on contract is difficult, cumbersome, as Arnold's already pointed out. So it's just a very tough management thing. And in that, these incentives don't exist. And so can we put incentives in place where people are recognized? They're recognized in their fit reps. They're recognized in the promotion scheme for being a terrific manager. I would like to think so, and we certainly have teed up some of those ideas. We do have to be careful how far we take it. We don't want our warfighters asking themselves, is my promotion going to be based on my management experience or my warfighting experience? So there's a balance in there. I don't think we've found that balance, but it's harder to find than I at least thought when I first started down the culture of savings path, where we're going to find these incentives and we're going to change them. It's tough, but we should keep working on it for sure. We've got to change the culture.
Arnold, anything from your Defense Business Board perspective?
I mean, as we know in industry and a lot of other places, people respond to incentives. You can change behavior with incentives. And, the old saying is you reward good behavior and you punish bad behavior. In the government structure, good behavior doesn't get rewarded and bad behavior doesn't get punished. The biggest thing we've got to do is shift from a focus on inputs to outputs. So right now, the whole system looks at how much money is being poured in procurement, R&D, MilPERS, O&M, MilCon, and nobody's looking really seriously at what are we getting for the dollars we spend, and are we getting the bang for the buck we should for the warfighter and taxpayer? I know, Michelle, you're very involved in looking at a number of these things. CNAS is very involved in trying to look at how we basically measure output and how we, for example, our budgets now in constant dollars, FY14 constant dollars, are higher than the peak of the Reagan buildup and higher than the peak of our spending in Vietnam. And yet our force structure is 50% smaller than it was when Jimmy Carter was president. Something's wrong. And so, as Christine said, very, very difficult. Admiral Winfield has said, and this is Admiral Winfield, that all these laws, rules, and regulations that we have in the system were put together to keep one person from making a mistake as opposed to enabling people to make the best decisions. I feel for our government employees. I'm not one that our people in the Department of Defense, you've all worked there, the civilian employees, the contractors, who, by the way, die on the battlefield along with the defense civilians in our military. They were killed when the Pentagon plane ran into. A good friend of ours, Terry Lynch from Senator Shelby's office, was meeting in the Army 3-star personnel office. They died in the Navy Yard, defense contractors along with the defense civilians. They all come to work every day trying to do the very best job they can and make the best decisions. We don't give them the processes where they can excel and do the right thing in their job. So it all comes back to process. We've got to figure out a way, Michèle, as pessimistic as I was, I would say that if we go to Congress and find a couple of people that are willing to work, roll up their sleeves and try to make some of these fundamental changes, I think you could make a huge difference by changing the incentive structure in government.
Well, we are just about to the end of our time. I want to thank you all for coming. We are in a very challenging and consequential period, and we wanted to shine a light on a very important topic that we did not feel was getting enough attention. There will be many more sessions like this hosted by CNAS in terms of trying to elevate the dialogue about how we manage in this time of austerity and still protect our national security. And we're also trying to contribute innovative ideas. Remember, you heard the idea of the nuclear tank here first. But please...
And the tungsten tip bayonet. Don't forget the bayonet.
But please join me in thanking our panelists, David, Christine, Arnold. And thank you.